30th, President Nixon announced on national television that a massive American South Vietnamese troop offensive into Cambodia was in progress. "We take these actions," Nixon said, "not for the purpose of expanding the war into Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam and winning the just peace that we all desire." These were familiar words to a war-weary public. Some felt that this decision was essential for attaining a just peace and sustaining America's credibility in the world. Yet others, particularly students, believed that this action represented an escalation of the war and a return to ex-President Johnson's earlier hopes for a military victory. As the fires from artillery began to burn in Cambodia, a raging fire of protest spread across the United States. At Kent State University, the reaction to Nixon's announcement was similar to that of other campuses across the nation. Friday, May 1st, 1970. At noon, about 500 students gathered around the Victory Bell on the Commons, the traditional site for rallies. A group of history students who had organized the protest buried a copy of the Constitution which they claimed had been murdered when the U.S. troops were sent into Cambodia without a declaration of war by Congress. 3 hours later, Black United students held a rally which had been scheduled before Nixon had made this announcement. Some 400 people gathered to hear Black students talk about recent disorders with the Ohio National Guard on their campus. Word spread quickly that another rally, one to oppose the invasion of Cambodia, was scheduled for Monday, May 4th at noon. Friday night, one of the first warm evenings of the spring, several hundred students gathered in downtown Kent in an area with a number of bars known as the Strip on North Water Street. A spontaneous anti-war rally began in the street. Twice while the rally was in progress, passing police cruisers were hit with beer bottles. Afterwards, the police stayed away from the area. Meanwhile, more people were leaving the bars. Many in the crowd chanted anti-war slogans and a bonfire was set in the street. The crowd blocked traffic for about an hour and then moved toward the center of town. Some members of the crowd began to break windows. Primarily political targets were attacked, including banks, loan companies, and utility companies. After being informed of the events, Kent Mayor Leroy Sutrum declared a state of emergency and arbitrarily ordered all of the bars closed. Kent police, along with the mayor, then confronted the crowd. The riot act was read, and police proceeded to clear the area. People inside the bars were forced to leave, forcing hundreds more into the streets. The crowd was herded toward the campus with tear gas and nightsticks, which was in the opposite direction in which some of them lived. 14 persons, mostly stragglers, were arrested. About $5,000 in damage was done, as 43 windows were broken, 28 in one bank. Saturday, May 2nd, 1970. On the morning of May 2nd, some KSU students assisted with the downtown cleanup. Rumors of radical activities were widespread, and Kent's ROTC building was believed to be the target of militant students that evening. During the Vietnam War, students on many college campuses opposed the presence of ROTC and often were successful in forcing the removal of ROTC from their campuses. A dawn-to-dusk curfew was imposed on the city of Kent, and students were restricted to the campus. At 5 p.m., shortly after assessing the situation, Mayor Sutrum alerted the Ohio National Guard. KSU officials were unaware of this decision. Shortly after 8 p.m., about 300 people gathered on the Commons, where a few anti-war slogans were chanted and a few brief speeches were given. An impromptu march began, and the participants headed toward the dormitories to gain strength. Large numbers of people joined the march. The now 2,000 marchers swarmed the hill overlooking the Commons and crossed the Commons. Then they surrounded the ROTC building, an old wooden World War II barracks that was scheduled to be demolished. Windows were broken, and a few persons eventually set the building on fire. Plainclothes police who were standing nearby made no attempt to stop the students at this point. Firemen arrived on the scene, but their actions were abandoned because some of the crowd attacked the firemen and slashed their hoses. The blaze quickly died out. The firemen eventually regained control, and the building was ignited again. This time, however, firemen arrived with massive police protection. Police surrounded the building and dispersed the students with tear gas. The firemen again got the fire under control. The crowd then moved to the front of campus. The students retreated to the Commons to find the ROTC building smoldering at both ends. Within minutes, the building was fully ablaze. The crowd then assembled on the wooded hillside beside the Commons and watched as the building burned. Many shouted anti-war slogans. In the first 2 weeks of May, 30 ROTC buildings would be burned nationwide. Armed with tear gas and drawn bayonets, the Guard pursued the students, protesters, and bystanders alike into dormitories and other campus buildings. Some stones were thrown, and at least one student was bayoneted. The question of who set that fire that destroyed the ROTC building has never been satisfactorily answered by any investigative body. Sunday, May 3rd, 1970. May 3rd was a relatively quiet day. By now, however, the campus was fully occupied by Ohio National Guard troops, and armored personnel carriers were stationed throughout the campus. Although some students and guardsmen fraternized, the feeling, for the most part, was one of mutual hostility. That morning, Ohio Governor James Rhodes, who was running for U.S. Senate, arrived in Kent and, along with city officials, held a news conference. Rhodes, running on a law and order platform, attempted to use this opportunity to garner votes in the primary election, which was only 2 days away. In a highly inflammatory speech, Rhodes claimed that the demonstrators at Kent were the handiwork of a highly organized band of revolutionaries who were out to destroy higher education in Ohio. These protesters, Rhodes declared, were the worst type of people we harbor in America, worse than the brown shirts and the communist element. We will use whatever force necessary to drive them out of Kent. Later that evening, a National Guard commander would tell his troops that Ohio law gave them the right to shoot if necessary. This merely caused to heighten the Guard's hostility towards students. Around 8 p.m., a crowd gathered on the Commons near the Victory Bell. As the group increased in size, Guard officials announced the immediate enforcement of a new curfew. The crowd refused to disperse. At 9 p.m., the Ohio Riot Act was read. Tear gas was fired from helicopters hovering overhead, and the Guard dispersed the crowd from the area. Students attempted to demonstrate that the curfew was unnecessary by peacefully marching towards the town, but were met by guardsmen. Students then staged a spontaneous sit-in at the intersection of East Main and Lincoln Streets and demanded that Mayor Sutrum and KSU President Robert White speak with them about the Guard's presence on campus. Assured that this demand would be met, the crowd agreed to move from the street onto the front lawn of campus. The Guard then betrayed the students and announced that the curfew would go into effect immediately. Helicopters and tear gas were used to disperse the demonstrators. As the crowd attempted to escape, some were bayoneted and clubbed by a guardsman. Students were again pursued and prodded back into their dormitories. Tear gas inundated the campus, and helicopters with searchlights hovered overhead all night. Monday, May 4th, 1970. At 11 a.m., about 200 students gathered on the Commons. Earlier that morning, state and local officials had met in Kent. Some officials had assumed that Governor Rhodes had declared martial law to be in effect, but he had not. In fact, martial law was not officially declared until May 5th. Nevertheless, the National Guard resolved to disperse any assembly. As noon approached, the size of the crowd increased to 1,500. Some were merely spectators, while others had gathered specifically to protest the invasion of Cambodia and the continued presence of the National Guard on campus. Upon orders of Ohio Assistant Adjutant General Robert Canterbury, an Army Jeep was driven in front of the assembled students. The students were told by means of a bullhorn to disperse immediately. Students responded with jeers and chants. When the students refused to disperse, General Canterbury ordered the guardsmen to disperse them. Approximately 116 men, equipped with loaded M1 rifles and tear gas, formed a skirmish line towards the students. Aware of bayonet injuries from the previous evening, students immediately ran from the attacking National Guardsmen. Retreating up Lincoln Hill, some students lobbed tear gas canisters back at the advancing troops, and one straggler was attacked with clubs. The Guard, after clearing the Commons, marched over the crest of the hill, firing tear gas and scattering the students into a wider area. The Guard then continued marching down the hill and onto a practice football field. For approximately 10 minutes, the Guard stayed in this position. During this time, tear gas canisters were thrown back and forth from the Guard's position to a small group of students in the Prentice